Awesome. Welcome, everybody, to another episode of the AI Pulse podcast. Joined today with, of course, my host, Marlene Wolfgruber, but also Morgan Conque, joining us on a really interesting topic. Now, I don't know if you guys know, but we've actually been using documents for over 5,000 years as humans, basically, mostly because our brains were getting too full to remember everything that we were supposed to talk about. But now, today, it's actually the organizations that are full of documents. They can't remember exactly everything they have. Now, if you think about it, back in 2007, we were already creating a lot of information, but fast forward to today, we are creating about 402 million terabytes of new data every single day. So that's actually more than the entire world created in 2007. We're sending 631 billion emails a day. And if those emails were clay tablets, we'd be probably buried in the earth under a new layer of sediment every 24 freaking hours. And unfortunately, of all of that data that we're creating, 90% of enterprise data is entirely unstructured. So almost all of it is entirely unread. And documents have actually become the dark matter of business. And that's exactly what we want to touch on today. So I've experienced this myself. I'm to structuring my files, even the digital ones, especially the cupboard over there for the topic that we want to touch on. But before we get into the nitty gritty details of how do we solve this problem, which is I think what we want to address today, have you guys experienced this as well, personally or professionally? What's your kind of immediate react that we've been doing this for 5,000 years and we still haven't figured it out how to do it properly, basically?
From my side, I would say in almost every customer case or story or request, we see documents are the business moment. Think claims, contracts, invoices, whatever. For example, a KYC process. So many documents involved, and simply, I think where decisions also live. And yeah, they are still here.
It's funny though, 2007, right? Because how we're defining documents is even changing, right? Things like digital transcripts of meetings are now business documents, and Slack channels and emails is off how we prioritize and run our work queues any given day. And all of those historically were unattainable in terms of extraction and leveraging the digital exhaust of our work. So it's really exciting to see that this is a bit of a untapped that businesses can integrate and find value in.
Just to get on this line, you would think generating all that digital data, we would have gotten over ourselves in terms of printing documents. But hold, if you guys want to know the number, today, 6.3 trillion pages are printed per year, which is amazing. The most interesting fact that I've heard all year was actually that the number of faxes being sent in the US is increasing again because it still remains to be apparently the most secure channel for certain types of things, especially in healthcare of all places. So I think this little merry-go-round of how long have documents existed and how a little bit ironic it is that we've been using this form of communication for so long, but at the same time, we still are trying to find ways to do it better. With that, I want to dive into the connection to artificial intelligence because this is an AI podcast after all. Now, a lot of people, also a lot of organizations, haven't solved this particular problem and the multitude of information that exists within these documents. I love the statistic that says 90% of this unstructured data, basically documents, have become the dark matter of organizations. We see that in all of our research that we do. We've seen that when we talk to customers. But interestingly, everybody's been trying to tackle this problem with the latest technology of the age, which is large language models. I wanted to ask you, Morgan, because you are in the field, you are doing this day in, day out with customers. How does the current AI wave really feel when it comes to these automation trends? Because it's not the first time that the world is trying to solve the document problem. We've had OCR, which was already been back to the 70s. We've had data capture, which was in the back office and fully enterprise grade. We've had RPA trying to do it with robots on your computer. And IDP was just the latest thing just a couple of years ago. So what's your feeling on this latest wave and the technology around it?
First, a bit of validation that with each of these waves feels more accretive in nature. Didn't negate RPA. The emergence of RPA didn't negate kind of old macro usage in Excel. We find that in a multimodal solution where we're layering these capabilities and using them for their purpose, we start to achieve the true value that we tend to tie a lot of the marketing noise around. It does feel different this time, though. In the last 2 years since the emergence of ChatGPT, the accessibility of that interface, using a chat interface for an LLM, moved us past the what is it, how does it work enablement hurdle that often happens each of these waves. We get a bit of a more proactive interest and adoption these days did in the past around AI. For the most part, the market sensitivity is driving a lot more conversations and is probably more of a factor than it has been in previous automation or hype cycles. And we're getting a lot more top-down drivers to transform and innovate than we have historically, which moves buying decisions through the cycle quite a bit faster.
That's really interesting. Would you say that even in its early, the validations there, a lot of technologies didn't negate each other, even though in the hype cycle, that was some of the things that were being, put out there, that this is a silver bullet that's going to solve everybody's problems. But if you want to go back to the early learnings that you had with the people that you've been working with, what would you say was working, what's not working, and what is the expectation right now versus what the expectation was, let's just say even a year ago?
So we have seen quite a few trends and marketing fads throughout the last couple of years, a bot on every
I love
AI
calling it AI
definitely.
washing, just FYI. I love that term. We've had whitewashing, we've had greenwashing, now we've got AI washing, and we're already on agentic washing because everybody loves doing it. Everybody loves doing it.
I know these days it's hard to find a conference where the agenda topics aren't some smattering of the previous topic. Now, every once in a while you'll approach it, and I'll say that those where we find fewer washing trends with AI or agentic are really industry focused conversations. So it does tell us that we haven't really intersected the industry leads to the point where the use cases are flowing, right? So a lot of the hype around this is easy to use, anyone can create an agent, has not yet translated to enterprise grade scaled solutions that have been operationalized. That's when we would start to see industry leaders hyping up their solutions and their success and the value to the business. But I do think we'll get there. There's still a lot of push around accessibility of tools, exploration and experimentation, but it has not yet scaled to the point that really justifies the amount of excitement. We'll see it there, but we have to get industry bought in more specifically.
Yeah, and if you think about really in practice, like what has really gotten easier or truly easier with technologies like generative AI, and what is still, you touched upon it a little bit, that it's not really translated into the enterprise world. But is there anything that has already gotten easier or truly easier?
The emergence of LLMs at its core allows us to address use cases that have higher variability, which means how we approach creation of these solutions does not necessarily need to account for every case, which was historically how we approached IDP development. We had to understand maybe the order forms that were unique to a customer or a vendor, and then iteratively build on that solution, requiring ongoing training for each unique case or form type. With the emergence and integration of LLMs, the creation of those solutions allows us to be a bit more vague and speak to intention and what we're aiming to achieve from an unstructured document. This also means that our processing of structured documents allows for greater variability. So we don't see anymore the one-off enhancements that are tied to form type, structure type as frequently.
With that, Morgan, would you be able to share some examples of where, in real world scenarios, the combination of the technologies has actually made sense? What is always interesting as well is where maybe you've worked with people that have tried to gone down another path and actually didn't make it there and had to reframe those expectations that we talked about before.
I do think it revolves around this concept of variability. Now, historically, automations and RPA, unattended automations or IDP processes that were customer facing, we were a bit more hesitant. We were a bit more siloed in what was built and for whom, right? So specific to a customer or vendor account, we process their order in line with maybe their specific MSA and pricing terms. So we had certainty. Now we have greater interest and trust that we can build those solutions that are customer facing because we can address the variability. Now that is interesting for us because our customers, our partners, we often can't control how they interact with our business. And we don't necessarily want to if we want to improve the experience of working with our company or our enterprise. That means meeting your customers and vendors where they're at, right? You supporting channels like email and maybe chat through a web interface or a portal that allows for natural language. Now, in order to interact with that, you do need an LLM or an NLP tool that you can integrate with IDP. If we're talking about attaching an order form to an email, being able to read the context and sentiment around that order form and quickly standardize the data with an LLM means we can overcome variability, but still ensure consistency and complete extraction, which makes us easier to work with. It's an easier buying cycle. As a customer and as a parent, maybe the best time for me to email my insurance provider is in the evenings and after soccer practice. Being able to support that for your end customers means I have a better engagement cycle with my insurance provider, and then they're able to get timely information, claims don't age, those types of considerations.
One pattern gets clear, right? It this reasoning that the LLM can do or the summarization without the reliability. This is probably, and I wonder if you see it the same, this is what this hybrid approach is beneficial about.
The reliability is absolutely a reason for concern, right? My superiors always told me, Morgan, trust but verify. Now, the same is true for any of these digital solutions where we are supporting our team in the engagement of our end customers, where revenue is key, right? We want to make sure that there are safeguards around it, whether it's in communicating what we don't want to say to customers, what are maybe payment terms we would never put into an order form or a contract. It runs very similar to humans, and we train humans, monitor performance of humans. We should absolutely consider the criticality of that in an enterprise grade solution. It also comes from a perspective of ongoing performance management and internal adoption. We can't accurately communicate the performance of a solution unless we create parameters around it in which we're measuring its success and communicating that back to the business. Now, we have one-off experiential, hey, the LLM produced something that said something inappropriate to a client in an email. That, from a marketing perspective, will kill change management around a digital solution. So you do want to safeguard some things, if anything, to ensure the longevity and internal adoption of that solution.
So if I can summarize a little bit what you've shared so far, is that to me, it seems that it's really important that you perhaps use a military term as well, pick your battles of where to deploy the technology and actually carefully think about if there's a better solution actually, or a better type of technology to use for a certain type of problem. I remember from my own personal experience having the conversation with a bunch of data that I had to show the distance between using a regular expression and a large language model was actually quite far apart. And in this particular instance, the regular expression, just like the macros that you mentioned, was the better thing to use because it actually was more reliable, more efficient, and a whole other things easier to manage. Would that correctly summarize what you've been sharing with us so far?
We see far too often, because of the wave, because of the hype, people wanting AI solutions or AI agent solutions without thinking, should the process have an AI agent involved? In RPA days, it was a bad process in means a bad process out. In today's scenario, if you create a bad process or a bad agent around something that requires something more traditional, you are now costing your program in the long term operational or infrastructure expenses that will start to devalue what you're bringing back to the business. So it definitely can be overkill. And we're finding that conversations triggered by AI agents often devolves into kind of pure IDP processing or unattended automation. But it doesn't mean that we can't reimagine the full end-to-end process flow. So we might start with an automation that solves the initial ask, but then highlight for them kind of the evolved enhancements in that process because of the emergence of LLMs as a hybrid solution. So it's not that it solves it immediately, it's that it provides them options of greater value add in a future state that would not be how we would initially solution.
Yeah, I think this, and you mentioned this with if you have a bad process and then you automate it, it's still a bad process. So would you agree that first looking at or identifying and analyzing, okay, what is the process looking today is the first step. And then the next step would be choosing the right technology and not the other way around, as you just described, that some customers come driven by the hype, wanting the new shiny object, but then in the end, it turns out what they need is something maybe more simpler or more effective. Just
No, I was just going to say, I think it absolutely holds true that as you go through this process, that's what I'm seeing as well, that you go from a mindset change of automate everything. And oftentimes, even if it's just a faster horse, it does start to create this insight into, okay, there are other options to actually augment intelligently, actually make sure that this actually makes sense, that the process gets changed. It brings me back to a conversation I've had with an organization that works with commodities. And they were building a ton of agents, not really agents, agentic AI that actually does something, but they were building a ton of assistant agents. So they had their traders, they had their people that were buying goods, they had their people that were selling them, storing them, doing the logistics, and each and every one of them had like their own helper assistant, similar to RPA, to do things, but in this case, to actually give them insights, collect information, summarize, reformat information that's available to them. But in the end, even though they had all these things, and I think this has also been discussed around the topic of vibe coding, the question was asked, are we actually making these people faster? Are we actually making sure that they can be more productive? Or are we giving them away to just be more lazy? Which, let's be honest, we're all human. We all love being lazy. At least I do. I'll admit that. I'll be the first one. But I think it's an interesting dynamic where we find ourselves in between, indeed, the personal productivity that has been a very much focus, creating all of these augmentations instead of really redesigning the process. But it is through that process of going through that pain, actually trying to deploy those types of solutions, then trying to see if we can actually measure any level of ROI, that we're now getting to where I think, in my opinion, organizations are getting to a point where, okay, let's do this intelligently. Let's actually look at the process first, look if we need to redesign it, bring it into the century. And if I admit to the fact that I love going back a little bit in history to see how things continue to happen over and over again, this is the build versus buy cycle that I've seen happen, where everybody stopped building things internally because it became a maintenance nightmare. Now then they went to buying. Now everybody wants to build again because they think that the technology is so easy. And now we're getting back to a point where people are like, we tried it, but it didn't really work. So now we're going to want to build, actually buy again so we can make it somebody else's problem. And I think there will always be this kind of cycle that happens. What for me is really interesting is that the cycle gets shorter and shorter every single time. I don't know if you're experiencing that as well, Morgan, in the real life. We're dealing with a multitude of corporations, enterprises, and customers every single day.
I'd say there's two responses to that. We often hear, I turned Copilot on. People are using Copilot on their desktop. That is probably a necessary approach to be AI first in the industry. There's is it making an individual uniquely productive? That onus relies entirely on leadership. So it's critical if you're rolling it out with an enablement program, a change management program, maybe you're creating cohorts within functional areas for them to share templates. And I created something to address this business challenge I was facing or this consistent task. That's where I think it's helpful. When you start creating a community around a new initiative like that, many programs do not approach that. The purchase and the turning on checks a block, and then the change management becomes very difficult, or it's tasked to somebody downstream who doesn't necessarily have the resources, maybe that kind of the information in order to really set it up for success. I'd say the flip side of this is even turning it on does something interesting for an organization. It gives team members access to play. The benefit of Gen AI and LLMs is it injects creativity and an expansion of knowledge to us uniquely that we don't necessarily believe in unless we're playing with it, unless we see it. Like even for agentic automation, our workshops where we're facilitating hands-on learning and talking about use cases in a public setting, in a community setting, is really where you see the light switch flick for people. Yes, they understand that there's value tied to it. Yes, they understand everyone's buying into it, but they don't then start to solution in their head. And for organizations to remain competitive, the majority of employees need to be thinking in that fashion. And in order to think in that fashion, they need to have the capacity and exposure to resources to play. And in that sense, I think it's a slower approach to transformation, of course, but it is a way.
It's interesting that you say it because we just recently did a survey, a Gen AI survey with enterprises in the US and in Europe. And exactly what you just mentioned is something we found out because it's the implementation of Gen AI for personal productivity, or not for personal, but for productivity at work is definitely something that's happening. But what we found out was it's not happening in a structured way or approach, and it's not governed. So they're just using it. And on top of that, bring you the shadow IT factor about it. That's also something. And if they're not using it, if they're not enabling it for employees, they will bring them anyways, and they will play with it. First, what you just said, it's definitely a good idea to enable it, to actually make it available to employees. But then the next step would be, and then see if you have a structured approach to it and really enable your employees to use it in a way that's making it even more effective or effectively and efficient for company purposes. Because right now it's more, hey, here, play with it. Maybe there is good outcomes. Probably could be doubled up or whatever if you really do it in a structured approach. Yeah. But it's interesting that you also see it.
Yeah, and I think where we'll probably see clawback of access and exposure to these tools will likely be driven by infrastructure costs, right? We opened up a massive dam of consumption-based pricing that I think many enterprises are going to start seeing against their P&L and looking for the validation. So if I am spending this and releasing this to the masses, what is my associated value back to the business? And that individual productivity becomes harder and harder to measure, if not for FTE job postings that I did not post or restructure in the more unfortunate scenarios. But if we start to apply this to enterprise grade use cases, businesses claw back consumption allocations, maybe they're aggregating the common use cases or business tasks, we can start to see a little bit more intention around the build. And maybe this is a mechanism by which we're soliciting ideas. We want to see what you create And now we start to aggregate around a concept of agentic ecosystems. What are the reusable agents that we're seeing the business find value in consistently, where we can safeguard access and make sure that they're tied to the right systems internally? It'll be very curious to see, because in that fashion, you've got a more aggregated quantification of the value back to the business.
I think that actually brings us to the last topic that I wanted to touch on. It's more forward looking in terms of we've talked about the hype cycles, the importance of it. That's actually where we started. All of that data, all of those documents, even printed ones, it still exists today. The technology that we move through is evolving and it makes it, I would say, with each wave, it becomes easier and easier to deploy, but it also requires for people to rethink the way their organizations work. Now, knowing all of that and drawing from your experience, where do you think intelligent automation, digital transformation, all of it is actually going to head next? What are some of the outcomes that you see from these workshops that you mentioned that people are trying to find solutions for? Is it existing problems? Is it new problems? Or is it problems that they didn't feel like they could tackle before and were just continuing to do manually because they felt the technology wasn't there
In
yet?
previous hype cycles, we had value propositions and KPIs built around cost takeout, headcount reduction, maybe even like fine mitigation as some obscure ones. We absolutely will see a shift from do more with less to just do more, where we are pursuing greater value with existing resources and reallocating those resources to more competitive initiatives because of the injection of creativity, because of the injection of tackling variability that allows you to be more intimate in client and vendor communication. Organizations that embrace a structured approach to transformation will allow their businesses to find net new revenue. One pure, true definition of agentic automation that Ashling has seen success with, it absolutely supported an autonomous agent that had a goal to process more RFPs. Now, that is not a agent that can access an LLM. That's an agent that is deciding, is this the right fit for our business? Do we have a compelling story for the end customer? Can we provide value add to their business challenge? And those that can solution and transform their business to approach processes with that perspective, they are solutioning differently. They are approaching new use cases in which they'll continue to increase their market competition, but not necessarily approach massive layoffs. They'll be able to empower their employees and engage more proactively. Approaching more of the goal-oriented processes is what I see over the next 2 to 3 years. There's many that will say that they're doing it now. We always ask them to prove it, right? Show us the receipts. Otherwise, they would be talking about it. And truly, it comes down to reusability of assets. We talked about iterating your solutions from OCR to RPA to IDP, and now with agentic and generative AI. But what we typically see in those builds are pretty consistent business challenges. I've got a massive inbox I need to triage out of. I have a data repository I need to update or I need to reference. I have an ERP where I have to create a record. Building reusable components across those ecosystems will define the winners. Otherwise, organizations will spin wheels on services partners and licenses without truly approaching efficiency in their transformation.
I also think what you just said goes well in line with what I'm thinking, because humans will now, or actually the ability of humans to think more critical, to be creative and have expertise and judgment about certain topics, will become the new value on top of or injected into these other more agentic systems, just become a new role. And I mean, there was this saying, right, about the ones that know how to use or leverage AI will be the ones on top. But the next wave is probably the ones that know when to inject the human in the loop, basically, are the ones that are going to succeed, because it's right, about deciding when to use or leverage critical human thinking and judgment and when not. And this also goes in line with deciding when an agentic or an agent makes sense or autonomous automation makes sense, and when it's just simply a pure repetitive task that doesn't require something like that.
And they both should exist, right? Like purely non-deterministic business, they probably wouldn't make much money. But
Absolutely. One of the things I love doing as we wrap up on the podcast episode is always ask the question to the guests to make some crystal ball predictions, because it's always just fun to see where everybody's head's at as to where do you think the things are going. If we just take everything that we've talked about in regards to documents, the volume, data, the fact that we get these shorter and shorter hype cycles, and that we continue to have this level of enablement that needs to happen of people and organizations for them to really see the true value of what technology can do. Where do you think is going to happen in 10 years' time, Morgan? Maybe 10 years is actually too far out because things are changing so fast. So let's make it 5 years just to see if we can get there. What's your crystal ball prediction?
There's a lot of aggregation happening within the ecosystem right now. We're seeing far more competitive plays from hyperscalers like Microsoft and Google and AWS, but it's not always accessible to the mid-size market where they don't have the capital expenditures to exhaust on service providers. They don't have necessarily the time to vet technologies and solution design. There will be far more commoditization for reusable elements that market will take advantage of. Now, whether it's going to be based in the learnings of enterprise organizations over the next 10 years, that'll be to say. But we saw a commoditization of RPA for a good amount of time. It did not result in a lot of scalable use cases, but we will see quite a bit more because of the accountability for variability that agentic automations allow.
So we're going to be able to deal with all the variability in life. That's going to be, I don't know whether that's going to be exciting or boring when there's no more variability in life, but we'll see when we get there. In recent work life, I look forward to it.
Well, Max,
I'll
you'll
admit
have to be
that.
sure to keep all your Post-its just to root you in the number of documents, the legacy in which you.
Exactly.
Yeah, and for everyone who is interested in more information around when LLMs are good fit and when they are not, there is a webinar with Morgan and Abby taking place, which can be watched on demand, obviously. And I really recommend that to everyone who is interested in going into more details on this topic.
Well, Morgan, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast. I don't know if you have any closing thoughts, but I found it really interesting to hear your side of the story about how organizations are evolving continuously and trying to deal with the document problem, and how technology continues to evolve as well. And it's all about bringing them closer together. I think that's one of the main conclusions that I drew from today.
Max and Marlene, thank you for the conversation. I think what it does speak to is that through perspectives and engaging in various different groups, you're able to identify the insights and true takeaways from your conversations. I challenge that to anyone curious around AI and LLMs, that true education comes through exposing perspectives. So start conversations, get people in a room, and stay curious. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Morgan.
All right.
Bye.
Thank you guys for listening. Bye-bye.